Hello, everybody. It is February 18th, 2024. We have a small but dedicated group, and we cannot start the session without mentioning Avdiivka. It was a very discouraging moment, and all I can say is, let's hope that this is the worst point we will ever reach, and that things will improve from now on. If so, we'll always regret Avdiivka, and we're very much wishing that that becomes the lowest moment of this whole struggle. I think everybody knows why the assistance is not coming at this time from the United States. In case you have not been following it, Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, last week, decided there would be no vote. This was, in my opinion, a terrible and criminal act, because we know that a majority of members of Congress would have voted in favor of sending aid. We know February 28th is the magic date when Congress can take up this measure again. I'm so sorry. Is really all I'm saying is, I'm so sorry. There is one person who has made this happen, and that's Mike Johnson, for reasons I think everybody understands. Now, let's think about other things that will prevail and go on forever, and things that take us out of this terrible context that we're in now. Let's think outside of the context. As I mentioned last time, a colleague challenged me. He said, "Why don't you do share some information about the various strategists and thinkers who followed George F. Kennan?" I think he said who were influenced by. And I want to preface all this by saying each individual we're going to talk about now was unique. I don't think we can say that any of these people were disciples of George F. Kennan, but some of them were coterminous, contemporaneous. Their thinking was thorough and very tied to reality. So I thought we would just spend a moment. What they all have in common is that they were all long strategists. We talked last fall about policy, tactics, and strategy. And that's really what this course is about. So today may seem a bit scattered because we're going to talk about a number of different people. None of them fit exactly. It's not as if there was a school created by George F. Kennan, but Kennan is the person who stands out in the middle of the last century in his containment policy. And so what was this all about? Let me just go back for a moment, and let's look at some things we've seen previously. This is a slide we used last fall. Lawrence Friedman. Again, let's anchor ourselves. Let's go back to where we started in talking about strategy. What is strategy? How does it work? And what skills can a person get to become an effective strategist? Strategy is the tool employed by individuals and governments and other entities to try to achieve a goal when there is opposition to that goal. Now, that's a kind of a improvised definition, but here Friedman, who's really the expert, and we met him, you remember talking to Lawrence Friedman, I think in October or November. He's the standard on long strategy. And we've seen this before. Let's just read it aloud, because he defines what strategy is. It's about maintaining a balance between ends, ways, and means. It's about identifying objectives and about the resources and methods available for meeting such objectives. Here comes one more person. Strategy comes into play where there is an actual or potential conflict when interests collide and forms of resolution are required. As you know, I resist the word resolution because I don't see it happening much in the world when there are conflicts. But I think we have to take Friedman's definition as the urtext on strategy. So strategy is the tool we use when we have an objective and when others are trying to prevent the objective from being fulfilled. I'm just going to show a couple of slides from this previous thing. Let's see, I want to enlarge this. Let me just do this. We talked about strategy that fails. And I cited Napoleon's idiotic invasion of Russia in 1812 as an example of the type of strategy, when you're trying to emulate a principle, you first want to find out what are examples of the way not to do this. There's the positive and the negative. Napoleon's invasion of Russia, which was idiotic and destructive to himself, and was signaled the end of his authority in Europe. I think I showed you this graph, and just to recapitulate, if you can see my cursor, the Grande Armée, which was an enormous military force gathered by volunteers, not by drafted individuals. There was a great frenzy, as you all know, in France around the figure of Napoleon, who was charismatic and he was convincing. In my opinion, he goes down as a terrible example of an individual able to ignite enthusiasm and passion. Even as I say that, I think of Hitler, Putin, and Donald Trump, who also have shown there's something about the quality of the voice which is able to manipulate large crowds. Now, sometimes charisma is a good thing, but let's look at when it doesn't work. Here we have 400,000 troops marching east with great illusions. We're going to take Moscow. And of course, they did this at the wrong time of year. They did not have proper transport. They did not have material and food and tents. They just left really recklessly. Here's a strategy, which is a good example of a failure. 400,000 march east. By the time they get to Moscow, 75% are no longer there. They remain with 25% of the number who started in Paris. In Moscow, we all know what happened. Is this good strategy? Attack Russia in the winter? Anyway, and then after we'll call it a defeat. In fact, we know that the Tsar ordered that the main buildings in Moscow be burnt and destroyed, leaving the French soldiers in the cold. And we'll call this a defeat. When they began to return to France, we're still at 100,000 here. And we see that as they return, the numbers decrease until we get to 10,000, which is something like 5% of the numbers that departed from Paris. So 95% of the soldiers were killed or escaped or defected. Here we have a group that decided, well, I'm not even going back to Paris. So just wanted to recapitulate this. And this slide, and when I see this slide, of course, I think of Russia and Ukraine. And Russia has not defeated Ukraine, and I hope never will. But when large countries try to dominate neighbors, this is from The Economist magazine, and we see that Narendra Modi is fantasizing having Kashmir. He can get it, but he will have indigestion. This was the point of this cartoon. So just recapitulating this concept of overextension, and we've heard this repeatedly with our the readings we've done and what we know about Kennan and Brzezinski and Gates. We're going to talk about that in a moment. Now, let's just review. Mm, I'm in a bit of technical trouble here. Let's see. I did rehearse this. Here we go. Um, oh, I see. Close. Start again. I want to remove. I want to remove this page. If somebody can tell me what I must do, I'll go to a different link. How about this one? This is very annoying. Sorry. Give me another minute. Um, I rehearsed this. I want to get this off the screen to see what's in back of it. Sorry, everybody. If someone can tell me what I need to do to remove. Sorry. Okay, we'll do it this way. Now, I showed you some of these slides about Kennan, and Kennan's going to be the central figure of what we'll talk about today. The other figures who are prominent in developing and practicing long strategy, I think we're going to see Kennan as the landing point, the inspiration for others. Now, Kennan was a very complicated, very neurotic individual. Very few people found it easy to work with him. But as we know, of course, his concept of containment, which was a middle point between aggression and surrender, was kind of the standard that people judged their own thinking by. Kennan, I've said this before, just to recapitulate what he meant in the Long Telegram and in the X article in Foreign Affairs. He was not really advocating belligerency. On the contrary, he was advocating avoiding conflict. Absolutely, that was his objective. And we know this from speeches and commentary that he made later in his life. He saw that this enormously influential concept, containment, was being misinterpreted. And in particular by Harry Truman, who was using this logic as a way of establishing a so-called red line with in the Truman Doctrine, which had to do with Greece and Turkey. He said to the Soviet Union, this is a red line. If you try to take, you've been taking countries in Eastern Europe. If you attempt to include Turkey and Greece in that, there will be a conflict. Now, Kennan was very upset about this. This is not what his intention was. And we know from his very open and strong opposition to the Vietnam War, for example, that if he wasn't a dove exactly, as opposed to a hawk, he was always in favor of avoiding conflict. Now, there's Kennan, and we went through these before. I won't dwell on this, but Kennan, there's a fundamental principle in Kennan, and we see this repeatedly in experts who are good at doing long strategy: avoid overextension. Overextension is what Napoleon did in attacking Russia. It's what Narendra Modi would do if he ever tried to take Kashmir. And it's absolutely what Vladimir Putin is doing in Ukraine. He's overextended. Now, Kennan was very much influenced by this novel, Buddenbrooks, which is as we said, a family in northern Germany. This is the story of the decline of this family. This family that had great commercial success, was very prominent socially, and then declined. Kennan was very moved by this. Kennan was affected by fiction, by theater, and also by Edward Gibbon, who was the English author who traced the fall of the Roman Empire, and which Gibbon saw as an example of overextension. Try to do too much, try to go too far, you will fail. And this is the meaning of this 18th century British term, chastise the contumacy. What he meant here was don't go beyond your abilities. You will be punished, and you should be punished. Now, Kennan read this book during long ocean crossings on ships. When he was posted in Europe, he would go back to America. The ships would take a much longer time, of course, than an airplane. And he read Gibbon and Buddenbrooks on ships that took him back and forth over the Atlantic. Now, Kennan's first and authorized biographer, John Lewis Gaddis, now teaching at Yale, was a great admirer of his subject. And Kennan comes out as a very positive character in the biography written by Gaddis. Now, here I'm just asking a question. Was Kennan a realist? Sometimes people think of this containment policy as an instance of realism. Was he a dove? Was he a hawk? I think we'll see in all of our examples today, there is no such thing as a pure realist. There's one exception. We'll get to that in a moment. You'll never see these terms in their pure form in real life. You'll never see an individual who's completely a realist or completely an idealist. If you remember John Simon last couple of weeks ago, when I mentioned George Bush as a neoconservative with realist tendencies, John Simon disagreed with me. He's a great guy, and I've seen him last week. And he wasn't able to see the slide that I projected, but he says, no, Bush he was something of an idealist. So let's remember that all the principles we're talking about, in their pure form, we'll never see them. Gaddis, who's written 5 or 6 or 7 books with the word strategy in them, has often referred to Isaiah Berlin, a philosopher in England of Russian extraction, taught at Oxford, was posted in Washington, D.C. during World War II, basically as a spy for the British government, a very friendly government, but wanting to know more than what was on the surface. Berlin was in Washington during World War II, and he developed this idea of the hedgehog and the fox. We're just reviewing this. Hedgehogs are this comes from Greek analogies, Aesop's fables. Hedgehogs they live vertically, they live underground. And if I remember, I don't remember verbatim, but the Isaiah Berlin defines a hedgehog as the being which knows one thing completely. We're talking about horizontal knowledge and vertical knowledge. Vertical, the complete absolute knowledge of a single discipline. And if you put these anthropomorphic ideas in a human application, here are some of the examples that Gaddis cites as individuals who were hedgehogs. They tend to be micromanagers, single goal oriented, obsessed. And here we have examples that Gaddis has brought up in his work. Now, on the other side, again, you'll never see any of these in their pure form, but it's a way of intellectually understanding what are the possibilities. Foxes live horizontally. I think Isaiah Berlin defines foxes as those who know a little bit about many things. A hedgehog knows everything about one thing. Foxes know a little bit about everything. Foxes, Gaddis tries to remain neutral in this, but it's clear to me that he prefers foxes. He finds that leaders who look horizontally and who see various different contexts are always more successful. And he gives the example of Queen Elizabeth, 15th century, the expansion, the thing that became the United Kingdom, largely done by Elizabeth I and her close associates, William Drake and others who assisted her, who followed her willingly and were able to expand the scope of the British Empire. Elizabeth I, according to Gaddis, was not obsessed. She was just able to go in many directions for the success and the increase of her empire. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, his approach to World War II, we know that he was sympathetic with the Allies. We know that he, because of the resistance in the American public, largely isolationist, he knew that if he tried to enter the war prematurely, things would go badly. He knew that. But obviously, after the Pearl Harbor attack, the coast was clear to enter the war. But prior to that moment, FDR was sending assistance to the Allies, and was clearly he had a point of view, but he was skillful in finding the right moment. He didn't just go in prematurely into a situation, as Hitler did, as Napoleon did, as Putin did. He waited until the moment was more propitious. Maybe we can put Churchill in this category. So, and again, Frank Castigliola, who published a biography of Kennan more recently, it's an entirely different Kennan. With Castigliola, who's from another university in Connecticut other than Yale, he does kind of a psychoanalytic study of Kennan and points out how crazy this man was. Kennan, according to Castigliola, was obsessed with Freud. He was torn himself. He even said this in his diaries. The contradictory choices that a person makes between civilization and eros. Eros, of course, is the sexual urge, but he's really talking here about the irrational wish that captures an individual's mind, opposed to civilization, which is orderly and predictable. This contradiction within Kennan's psyche was destructive enough that he did have a nervous breakdown in 1935 and was hospitalized. So Kennan, before we talk about the people who followed Kennan, we're just spending a moment remembering who Kennan was. Very complicated person. And I'm personally very grateful to Kennan because I think one reason we never had a nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union was Kennan in the background, a single individual with clear thinking, long strategy. We're not talking about things that will happen tomorrow, but 70 years later. And he predicted that if America could stay true to its own values and its own identity, in the end, they would prevail over the Soviet Union. Let's look at Kennan's inner soul for a moment, because this is important. What is it that makes a person a fox or a hedgehog, or that makes a person an effective grand strategist? I believe, and this is Castigliola, but it comes directly from Kennan's diaries. He saw, let's see. In 1958, Kennan attended a performance of Chekhov's Cherry Orchard, and he was so moved by this. He was, we don't exactly know exactly why he was so moved, but these are Kennan's words below. The experience stirred all the rusty, untuned strings of the past and of my own youth. Riga, where he was trained, where he received his Russian language training, and the Russian landscape, the staggering, unexpected familiarity and convincingness of the Chekhovian world. It stirred up, in other words, my Russian self, which is entirely a Chekhovian self and much more genuine than the American one. Gaddis entitles his biography of Kennan, an American mind, because Gaddis is responding to the idea that Kennan really didn't like America very much and felt more psychic and emotional affinity with the Russian people, certainly not with the Kremlin. He hated Stalin. But and here we have Kennan saying my Russian self. So this is a very torn man. I was going to say confused. I don't know if we can say he was confused. He was very torn between he had very strong feelings. This would be the eros part, civilization versus eros. He defines himself as a Chekhovian. Chekhov, we were all familiar with Chekhov's plays. These are plays that depict great sadness, great unfulfilled longings, tremendous wishes and longings on the part of the characters, and total frustration. They never get anywhere. They spin around and around, end up nowhere. And Ken was very moved by this. We don't know exactly what went on in his mind. Let's see. And he see this as below the surface in his own thinking. I sat there blubbering, weeping like a child, and trying desperately to keep the rest of the company from noticing it. So here's a grand strategist who is very much prey to his own strong emotions. And we must remember that strategists have emotions. And we'll see in a moment, if I can get the screen to work, we'll see examples of others. A little prayer here. I need to get this off the screen. If someone can guide me, this is crazy. I need to remove, oh, here we go. Okay, close. Now, this is very embarrassing. I need to close this. I need to remove the screen. Very
Try
sorry.
the upper right corner.
What's that? What's that?
The upper right corner, and then you can either close it fully or just partially. So it will be in the bottom of your screen. Either the cross or the dash.
Sorry, I can't hear you, whoever is speaking. This is making me very frustrated. Nope, I don't want to do that. I need this screen removed. That's all I need. Let's try this again. Let me try, I don't know, try this one. No. Click on the X and the rubber. Oh, here, this one. No. Now this would end the session. Give me another chance here. I've done this before. All I had to do was drag this off the screen. Everybody, thank you for bearing with me. Most frustrating. I'm doing escape. All I need is to remove that thing that's on the screen. That's all I need. Aha. Okay, Zoom is wanting to frustrate me. It's doing very well. Back to share screen. This is a PowerPoint that I spent lots of time on this. I should probably stop recording for a moment. Let's see. I may have to declare defeat here.
What if you just minimize the screen?
Sorry?
You try and minimize it. Just circle
Yes,
to
but
the cross.
the app for minimizing it is behind this bar. Here we go. Here we go. Ah, okay. I think now I have it. Okay. Oh boy. Okay. Sorry, everybody. We're fully here now. Okay. So here is a sequel, and I'll try to make this kind of brief, and we can have a discussion afterwards. I'm calling this Kenan's Times and Successors. I chose carefully. I would say these people are not disciples of Kenan. Some of them, in fact, precede him, like Morgenthau, for example. Morgenthau, the pure realist. But they all stand in the shadow, in my opinion, of this huge presence of George Kennan. So we're going to talk about these individuals. The only one left alive is the last one, Robert Gates, whom we met last fall. He was kind enough to meet our group. But let's look at these others. We're not going to be able to go exactly in chronological order. There's if some of them precede others, but let's just look at those. These are the names, and this is very America-centric. We're talking about Americans because that's kind of the topic of this course. These are people who all did long strategy, and they had different approaches, but in order to have an intellectual basis to even understand how their minds worked, we look at, what is grand strategy, and then the first concept, the first abstract concept to try to define would be realism. And we have one individual, Hans Morgenthau, who says, I am a realist. All others, even Kissinger, who was sometimes thought of as a realist, had other things going on. The only, and as I said, we'll seldom see any pure form of any of these principles, except with Hans Morgenthau in his book, which we'll see in a moment. Well, I'll get to that later. These are abstract concepts. We all, in ourselves, we have elements of both. If you're a realist, you have a harsh view of human nature. You believe that humans, like animals, where their primary instincts are to get resources, to get food, to obtain, if necessary, to enter into conflict with other human beings. And the idea, the sort of anthropological idea behind realism is human beings have noble thoughts, and they have ethics, and they have moral goodness, but what prevails in a situation of stress is not that. It is the animal instinct. Human nature is unchangeable, resource scarcity, and they are focused on the notion of power, which was certainly something Napoleon tried to do. He was a realist, but I would say he was a failed realist. Power, and this is what Morgenthau completely focuses his attention to, is the ability of one human being to control another. This is a very important concept, and it's really, it sounds very crude and very Machiavellian, but it's really the basis of what people do and how they think when they're involved in a competition or in a conflict. Now, we will see later in this discussion that two very fascinating figures, Scowcroft, who is kind of a realist, and who was a Republican advisor to presidents. He was the national security advisor. And his counterpart, these two individuals were not enemies. They greatly respected each other. But Brzezinski, certainly a realist, working for Jimmy Carter, probably the best example of an idealist that we have. These are fascinating competitions of things, unlikely combinations. Scowcroft, who is, I think he resists being called a realist, but he says realism is the recognition of the limits that can be achieved. This is very close to what Lawrence Friedman says when he talks about reconciling objectives and resources. If you can understand that your resources are inadequate to meet your objective, then you're a realist. Brzezinski, quoting Reinhold Niebuhr, this may be a little bit off to the side between realism and idealism, but Reinhold Niebuhr, an American theologian, who is sometimes thought of as a realist, but and I believe he considered himself a realist. Very interesting to have a theologian who's really not motivated. He's motivated more by realism than idealism. Very influential person. The more the state declines, the more it proclaims its superiority. Again, we return to this principle of overextension. And this is what Niebuhr is all about in his book, The Irony of American History. He cautions American leaders, don't try to do too much, you will fail. And he says this, of course, he has a moral and ethical basis. He's a theologian, but he's a strategist. When he advises American leaders, don't overdo it. Example, the Vietnam War, which is a ridiculous, destructive overextension, and which led to a terrible failure. Now, the opposing view, again, we will almost never see this in its pure form, is based on the idea that humans are perfectible, that we're capable of going to a higher level beyond sovereignty. Sovereignty is a very limited form of intrastate organization. Wouldn't it be nice if the United Nations actually had the authority of sovereignty to deploy troops to put down a violent situation? I'm thinking of Sudan, for example. Obviously, Russia, Ukraine. The belief, wouldn't it be nice if there was a higher authority? Unfortunately, there isn't. But if you're an idealist, you believe that it's possible and someday it could happen. A realist will say, don't count on it. And the sense that humanity has common interests and must find common solutions. A realist doesn't think that way. A realist, like Hans Morgenthau, will say, we've just seen what happened in Europe in World War II. We need simply to understand that some countries will never behave properly, and we have to do whatever we need to make them stop. Lisa Khodorkovska, your comment?
I have a question. You just said about this UN military authority, let's say, and I've been like through the last few weeks, I've been thinking a lot about the existence of a common European army. And I wonder, in your opinion, is thinking about this more of idealism or realism in today's agenda?
Excellent observation, Lisa. And I think everyone here can make their own judgment on that. It seems to me that Europe, we've just had the Munich Security Conference. Europe is terrified that Donald Trump might become president of the US. We know that Trump many times has said he doesn't like NATO, he doesn't trust NATO. What Europe is doing in response to that, to me, I see it as realism. It's the understanding that Russia will always be an enemy. The United States has been supportive in the past, but we cannot count on their support in the future. Lisa seems to agree with me that Stoltenberg, the leader of NATO, has said we must prepare because we cannot count on the United States. This makes many Americans very distressed, very angry, and I'm one of them. I find this what's happening in the United States now extremely disturbing. I think it's absolutely proper that NATO should imagine its future without the United States. It's a terrible thought, but we have to think about it. Let me speed through some of these. I think I showed you last time this graph, and the point is nobody exists exactly in the center of this intersection. Nobody no, in the real world, nobody is a pure idealist or a pure realist or a pure non-interventionist or intervent. The circumstances, the context will always drive individuals in one direction or another. We looked at this before. Here's some examples, I think, of individuals that illustrate. John Quincy Adams often quoted, "We do not seek demons abroad. We will take care of our own country." This was at a very early stage in the United States. And at where the United States, the founding of the United States had much to do with the wish to just leave Europe behind. Europe is seen as decadent, ineffective, not a good model for social organization in the 18th century. And Adams would be an example of a thinker, a strategist who, and as Washington also saying, let's just stay at home and do the problems, deal with the challenges we have at home. Let's not get involved in foreign adventures. I don't know if you want to call this isolationism, which is something we're suffering from right now in the United States. We have millions of people who are thinking like hedgehogs. They're thinking vertically. This country, the rest of the world is unmanageable. We're not interested in them. This is certainly not the opinion of these individuals. It is of Ron Paul. Ron Paul despises everything that's outside of the United States. He is an isolationist. I don't think you would, Washington in his departure speech, I can't quote it exactly, but do not become involved in foreign adventures. We must remember that at that time, the United States was a frail, tiny entity. It had no massive power on the world stage. It did not have much of a military. It did not have much of an economy until the middle of the 19th century. So these were quite reasonable bits of advice. Don't overdo it. Don't overextend. Overextension is a theme of this whole discussion. Ron Paul is another case. Again, I put George Bush over here in the neoconservative camp because the neoconservative camp has elements of all of these, but I put them on the right side of the graph. They are interventionist, but they are a combination of realist and idealist. And I think rereading Scowcroft, which I did yesterday, and hearing John Simon, I think we would put George W. Bush north on this graph. We would say he was sort of an idealist. These other two, purely realist, but of course they worked very much in tandem. They made enormous mistakes in invading Iraq, which was every strategist today agrees this was a stupid and ruinous thing to do. Bush, I believe, was carried along. We'll never know. Was it really his idea? I guess he was convinced by these individuals. Invade Iraq. He may have also had a personal obsession because of Saddam Hussein having threatened his father, George H.W. Bush. But anyway, on this graph, this group does not really belong on the graph, so I put them separately. Now, getting back to Kennan, who's sort of the point of departure for this discussion. Was he a realist? Was he an idealist? It's complicated. Kennan is thought of by doves, considered him a hawk. Hawk considered him a dove. Was he a realist? When we remember how he reacted to the Chekhov experience, he was a poet. He actually wrote poetry, and he had a mystical feeling of identity with simple people, both in Russia, in the Soviet Union, and in the United States. He was drawn very emotionally. In that sense, he was the perfect idealist. So we have an example here of somebody often referred to as a realist, but not entirely. We must keep these concepts in mind, but we must not be slaves to them, because we'll never find many examples of one being purely one way or the other. The exception, Hans Morgenthau, an immigrant from Germany, a Jewish citizen who was very aware of what Hitler had done. And in reaction to his the trauma and the disgust and the condemnation of what had been happening in Europe, not only Germany, but also the Soviet Union and other, his reaction, very strong, very emotional, but very rational. And Hans Morgenthau is the only example I can think of somebody who purely belongs in one of these camps, and this would be realism. His book, Politics Among Nations, Struggle for Power and Peace, notice the date, 1948. He's coming out of World War II. He's convinced that if ever again there should be something like Nazi Germany, get ready and don't expect that appealing to a higher, the angels, the potential good in other people, don't be misled by that. I think you can apply this to the current Kremlin. If you think you can persuade a leader like Putin or Hitler, you're being very naive. He believes he's the opposite of naive. And I've copied some of the things that he says. Let's just look at the things in bold. In politics, like society in general, is governed by objective laws that have their roots in human nature. Human nature is not a good thing, not a bad thing, but it's Morgenthau neither hates nor admires human nature. He sees it as just an extension of the animal kingdom, and writes a very thick book, like 500 pages. Every page is perfectly consistent. Do not look to the nobility or the good side of human nature. It exists, but don't count on it, basically, is what his thesis is. Objective laws, he's talking about natural laws, not statutes that have their roots in human nature. Human nature, we can almost take this as a negative. Human nature, the ambition, the stupidity, the overextension. If you have somebody standing in your way, do not be duped to think that merely appealing to their higher nature would ever change their behavior. I would say that Putin is a perfect example of that. He quotes Thucydides that why do individuals work together? Why do they have an affinity? Not because they love one another, but because their interests coincide. This is pure realism, and it's good to see these concepts in their pure form. Again, you'll seldom or never see them in a living individual, but just to understand what is realism. And let me skip here. We're taking probably too much time. Morgenthau says, well, I'm a political realist. And so here's the question that I want to answer. How does this policy affect the power of a nation? He has defined power as the ability of one person or one group to force others to do what I want them to do. That's power. Now, he says, because I'm a realist. If I were an economist, I would be answering a different question, asking a different question. How does this policy affect the wealth of a society? Again, let's be very transparent, very simple. The economist is stuck in his or her thought process and can only legitimately ask a single question. How does a policy affect the wealth of a society? The lawyer, who's not rooted in morality particularly, the lawyer is also part of this thing called human nature, and the lawyer wants to know, is this policy in accord with the rules of law? This has nothing to do with a positive or negative judgment about your opponent. It's just if somebody is opposing you, get ready. Don't be naive. Just use your long-term strategy to try to prevail. The moralist, I don't think he hates moralists, but he understands the moralist has completely different objectives. Is this policy in accord with moral principles? Perfectly legitimate question. but Morgenthau is siloed. He is none of those things. He's a political realist. So he's purely concerned with power. Later we'll see Kissinger is another example. I think an example that curdled, that went very bad. If he was a realist, and I think most people think of Kissinger as a realist, his absence of morality caused his policies to fail. So when I say that, I'm reflecting my own beliefs. Every person has to come to a resolution themselves on, look at this graph. Where do you belong on this graph? Everybody, every individual will go to a different area on the graph and may change over the course of their life. They may go from this end to this end. This is what educated people do. They look at circumstances and they think, and they adjust their points of view. Okay, now Reinhold Niebuhr, who actually whose work started before Kennan, but you see the dates are more or less similar. Niebuhr, theologian, trained at Yale Divinity School. People cite him as a realist. I'm putting this on this slide as he's kind of he is a theologian, and he does have strong elements of idealism in his writings. Isn't it interesting that a theologian would be such a basic source for the U.S. military? They all read Niebuhr, and so did Niebuhr. Was Barack Obama's main inspiration. He said so many times. He quoted Niebuhr. Niebuhr's idea was rooted in the concept of overextension. In his book, The Irony of American History, he talks about the fatal flaw of America is trying to go bigger and wider, and going more distance and overdoing it. And he strongly advocated that America don't do this. It's going to ruin your country sooner or later. This was absolutely the basis of Obama's phrase, don't do stupid stuff. What he actually said, don't do stupid shit. And he said many times, Obama was purely motivated by his reading of Niebuhr. He said so many times. And his policies, which were timid, let's say, which were not expansionist, they were not foreign adventures. Obama opposed all of this. It was his Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, who convinced him that he had to join France and England in intervening in Libya to prevent the death of many civilians. The UN principle, R2P, the responsibility to protect. Obama didn't want to do this. He really resisted. And I think in retrospect, he was right. Hillary Clinton convinced him, we need to join France and England in rescuing people who are about to be victims of basically a genocide in Libya. All of these concepts become very problematic when you're dealing with genocide. And that's a whole subject, I think, for another discussion. If you're an idealist, you want to do whatever you can to prevent a genocide. If you're a realist, and I think this is the realist side of Niebuhr that Obama admired. If you're a realist, you'll say, genocide? I'm afraid that if we intervene in Libya, it could just make things worse. And indeed, it did. Libya got worse. Perfectly good motivation in intervening to try to stop Gaddafi. Gaddafi had said, I'm going to kill them like cockroaches. And he would have done so. It was Benghazi, that he was going to just destroy Benghazi and all of its population. The idealist wants to step in to say, never again, we're going to do whatever we can. And the realist response to that is, I also care about the well-being of human beings. And I believe that the more we do, the worse it will become. Overextension. Now, the national security advisors, these are two of the greatest. Brzezinski, 1928 and 2017, was Jimmy Carter's national security advisor. Great irony here. Carter was something of an idealist. Brzezinski from Poland, similar to Morgenthau, coming from a system that he thought was a terrible way to organize human beings, and was determined to he was something of a hawk, and he was determined to do anything to prevent the Soviet Union from going any further. Here he is with some of my students at the time. This one's from Moldova. This one's from Norway. This one's from Poland. And it's the only picture I have of Brzezinski. He was austere. He was patrician. He was not really very approachable. He conflicted with his boss, Carter, quite a bit. Carter used to, as Brzezinski said later, my boss, the president, was always telling me that I was wrong, but he never raised his voice. Carter was a gentleman. But they argued all the time. And these arguments are very positive when you're thinking long strategy. You want to look at every possibility. The more multiplicity of points of view, the more chances of success you'll have. Now, Brzezinski and Brent Scowcroft were of opposing political parties. Scowcroft, a Republican, Brzezinski, a Democrat. They did differ in their points of view. In some quotes I'll show you later, we see an enormous mutual respect that they had for each other. They both agreed very much that the National Security Council, which was created shortly after World War II, had grown way too big. It had become a bureaucracy. And under Brzezinski and Scowcroft, the NSC was, had a limited scope, because the idea was to have it as a think tank to advise the president on matters of policy. Later, it expanded and became a bureaucracy that became almost like a rival to the Department of State. And both of these two felt that this was a very ominous and terrible thing. These, again, are students. Here's a young man from Germany. And Scowcroft was much more approachable. He was much more affable. He was a very nice man. Look at him. Here's a class that I was teaching at the time. Look at how pleased he is to meet younger people. Very charming guy. Now, we think of Scowcroft and Brzezinski as realists, but if we look at this book, I'm going to speed through this given the time, and we can come back to this if anybody wants to. This was Steve Clements, who was the head of something called the American, it was a small think tank, the American Foundation, a small think tank that transformed and changed its name several times. Steve Clements invited David Ignatius to conduct a series of interviews with these two individuals shortly before Barack Obama became president. And the occasion for having these conversations was, okay, Brzezinski, you are retired. Scowcroft, you're retired. What would be your advice to our new president, Barack Obama? And this book was conducted, the conversation, it was Ignatius in the middle asking questions of these two in preparation for a big transition from George W. Bush to Barack Obama. I have written these down mainly for the record. It's way too long. I'll just read a few little quotes here. This is from the book marketing item. While one author is a Republican, the other a Democrat, they broadly agree on the need to adapt to a new international environment. We say today everything's new and everything's in transition, but you know what? Everything has always been new and has always been in transition. This is following 9/11. America was obsessed with another 9/11 happening. They understood that there were some negative things beginning to happen. This would be 2008. Putin had been in power for 7, 8 years at that point. Nobody knew quite yet just how destructive Putin would be, but he was a challenge. He was something to deal with. And these two were, their job was to advise the president on matters of terrorism, how to prevent terrorist attacks, and what do we do about the new thing called the Russian Federation. They saw this as a new international development. And as the publicist correctly says, where they disagree, their exchanges are always deeply informed and provocative. How refreshing. I really commend this to you. Get a hold of this if you can. America and the world. You've got some of the finest strategists we've ever had, respecting one another, disagreeing clearly on important matters, and able to converse. This is a marvelous book, and I have too many slides on this, but just to point out a few in bold, I have some of the things that come out. I was taking notes. It's a dialogue. It's a journalist in the middle, David Ignatius, and these two individuals. I don't know if they were close friends, but they each had very high regard for the other. Where they disagreed, they said so very clearly. Brzezinski, I know this becomes an emotional thing at this time, thought that NATO expansion would create conflict with Russia. Now, I think we all have strong feelings about NATO expansion. I mean, I'll expose mine. I think the more the better. What we now see as the Russian Federation, a realist has to say, we must become more powerful, more prepared for a conflict, because nothing good is coming from the Kremlin. Brzezinski was a realist, but he saw NATO expansion as a strategy that might not work. And this isn't, remember, we're at 2008 here. This was a relatively calm period between the US, Western Europe, and the Soviet Union. There was the question of NATO expansion. We know what happened. It expanded, and it became, we don't know if Putin is blowing smoke or if he's using this as a pretext, but he has referred to NATO expansion as an existential threat against his country. Nonsense, I would say. But Brzezinski understood there could be some downside. There could be a risk in provoking a conflict that could otherwise be avoided. In this, was he a realist, an idealist? I think you would say he was a realist, unlike his boss, Jimmy Carter, who was more of an idealist. Now, I'm going to skip through many of these things. Here, Scowcroft agrees with what John Simon said 2 weeks ago. Bush 43, that's George W. Bush, says he was seen as a neocon. In fact, he was open to all ideas. We certainly thought at the time George W. Bush must be an idiot. Only an idiot would invade Iraq with the belief that we would be greeted with flowers and celebration, as Putin believed would be happening in Kharkiv after his invasion. How wrong, how stupid. But in retrospect, we have to think of Bush 43 as something of an idealist. He meant well, put it that way. It was a terrible catastrophe, his invasion of Iraq. And both of these individuals were absolutely opposed to the invasion of Iraq. Realism, idealism. Anyway, but here, if it's even worth the effort, Bush 43, here we have Scowcroft pretty much saying what John Simon told us. He was something of an idealist, naive, but he was something of an idealist. Now, both strategists are exactly in agreement that American leadership is essential. Brzezinski, Ignatius says, is American leadership necessary? Brzezinski, yes, as a catalyst. Scowcroft says, amen. Again, these are my notes from this wonderful book. Now, these two individuals of opposite political parties wrote a joint memo addressed to Barack Obama saying these four things. Discuss with everybody. Don't be secretive the way Bush was. Don't be um, manipulative. Just talk with people and lay your case out very transparently and get different points of view. Don't lecture the Iraqis. They agreed on this. This was in their joint memo. Don't submit a timetable. Both are opposed to saying this notion of a red line. If you don't do something by a certain time, there will be don't do that. Don't do that. And Robert Gates is very much in agreement with this. Never issue an ultimatum. Never issue an ultimatum. It's stupid because if someone calls your bluff, as Saddam Hussein did, or rather as the president of Syria did in actually employing new chemical weapons against his own people, Obama had said, red line, that's an ultimatum. It was a terrible mistake because there was no follow-up when the president of Syria actually did use chemical weapons against his own people, have regional talks. So there were both of them strategists very much in favor of open dialogue. And they felt very strongly that Obama needed to have this as part of his approach to his international challenges. Brzezinski, here they very much disagree. And this has to do with the Iraq War. Brzezinski says, we are part of the problem. Mind you, it was Bush and Scowcroft, Bush with Scowcroft's assistance, who decided to invade Iraq. Brzezinski, opposing political party, we are part of the problem. Scowcroft disagrees. Withdrawing ruins a solution. And then we differ. This very simple statement, very respectful. Nobody raised their voice, but simply we differ. So important and complicated challenges almost never have obvious and simple solutions. There's a lot of nuance. Let me skip through a lot of this. Should we talk to Hamas, says Ignatius. Of course, 15 years before October 7th of last year, no idea what Hamas was going to be doing in Gaza. Scowcroft says, yes, we must talk. Well, that's a realist. We knew that Hamas was a bad entity, it was a harmful group. It had not yet staged this horrible attack on October 7th. But Scowcroft said, maintain dialogue. I'm going to let him speak for himself. Each person on this call needs to imagine, what would you do in this situation? Hamas is going to be a threat in the future. What do we do about this? Do we just try to kill them? Scowcroft says, we must talk. Brzezinski quotes Sun Tzu, let your enemy defeat himself. Brzezinski was very much of a Sun Tzu person. The pivoting, the three-dimensional chess, just think it through and see how you might prevail in a conflict. And if the opposing side is doing something stupid, encourage them to remain stupid. The topic of drones was a very big issue in the early Obama years. We know that Obama used drones much more than any previous president. We didn't quite know that at the time of this conversation, 2008, but Ignatius, in referring to drones, says, if you shoot the king, don't miss. And Brzezinski says, that's right, and don't kill too many of his relatives. Strategy. At what point do you do kinetic operations to try to destroy the enemy? Obama had made a tremendous use of drones to assassinate terrorists, and with the understanding that with each attack, there would be overspill, there would be the accidental killing of innocent civilians, very, very difficult question. If a terrorist is, if you believe that the terrorist eventually is going to kill thousands of people, how far do you go in taking out that person? Are you willing to have innocent civilians also harmed, knowing that this would create more terrorism? It's one of the great paradoxes that we deal with to this day. Scowcroft, he was opposed to Ukraine being in NATO. Brzezinski, again, from a formerly Soviet country, said very emphatically, with very personal feelings as a Polish American, let Ukraine decide. So I think we, in this context, we tend to celebrate Brzezinski. Scowcroft, and both of them had reservations to NATO expansion. And let's remember the context. This is way before we knew how destructive Putin was going to be. I will speed through some of this. They both, and later in the book, they both agree very strongly. Dignity is what characterizes and should characterize the United States and its foreign policy. And it is what other people seek. It's, you know, when we think of the revolution of dignity at Maidan Square, boy, they were prophetic, weren't they? In emphasizing in this matter, they agreed completely. People seek dignity, which includes freedom and the ability to decide one's own fate, and it complicates human society because, as Brzezinski says here, dignity entails diversity. And this is strategy, folks. If you want to be effective in dealing with foreign challenges, remember that what other people are most interested in having is the respect of others. This is a very emotional, psychological thing. Interesting that both of them are very emphatic on this point, and do everything you can in favor of the dignity of others. And we go to the, let's go to the very end. That does a kind of a joking little moment. Ignatius, being a very courtly, polite person, he says, "Well, it's been a pleasure to talk with a prominent Republican and a prominent Democrat." To which Brzezinski says, "Which is which?" The point being, realism, idealism. You know, we are thinkers, we are strategists. We pull from elements of both. We sometimes disagree. We do the best we can, and a good strategist is not an ideologue. A good strategist is not purely of one political party or another, but they share an interest in wanting to make an entire situation to give advantages to the nation rather than to one political party. We may be going into a period now in American policy where that's falling apart, where strategists, if you can call them that, I don't know if we have any at the moment, are tending to advocate actions that will benefit their political party, not the nation. This is certainly the case with Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House of Representatives. And then Ignatius closes this out with a very generous thank you. Let me just speed through the rest of this. We can come back to it in a future session if you want. George Shultz was a magnificent Secretary of State. He was honorable. He cared about people. He was deeply moral. He was engaged. He cared. I love this photograph of him with Shevardnadze. Look at how Shultz is bending forward, not submissively, but he's making an effort. There's a great meaning in the physical gesture here that Bush is making. He's saying to Shevardnadze through his body language, I respect you. I know that dignity is a factor, and I assure you that I take you seriously. The relationship between these two was a marvelous moment in the troubled bilateral relations between now the Russian Federation and the United States. On this occasion, and there's Schultz's boss, President Reagan, in the background. Here, this relationship resulted in INF, the treaty eliminating intermediate range nuclear forces. I can talk at length about that. It was a marvelous moment in world history where two prevailing powers voluntarily assured the world that they would abandon an entire class of weapons. It was a great moment in international affairs. Donald Trump terminated the American agreement to INF. Now we get to the notion of the gardener. I think maybe we don't have time to talk about Henry Kissinger. Let me just say, I think you'll see in these slides, I despise this man. He's described as a realist. What did he really do? He was, this picture is taken in 2017 when he was brought in to advise President Trump. I have too many slides here, but what he did, here he's sitting with his friend Mobutu Sese Seko, a dreadful dictator of the country that was called Zaire at that time, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Mobutu was a monster. He was a gangster. He was a murderer. And here is Kissinger's comment about Mobutu Sese Seko. Courageous, politically astute, relatively honest in a country where government corruption is a way of life. Let's let that speak for itself. We know what he did in Latin America. Here he is with his good friend, Augusto Pinochet, the dictator who murdered his predecessor in Chile. We think, with the help of Henry Kissinger, is this realism? To show friendship to murderers? I have issues with that. Enough said. Here he is, clearly in a jovial, friendly relationship with Argentina's foreign minister, Alberto Viñas, at a time when Argentina was murdering opposition leaders. We know that many thousands were lifted up into helicopters and pushed out of the window, falling to their deaths. Apparently, this did not bother Henry Kissinger. He claimed that he did not know this was happening, but we know that that's a lie. We know that he knew. We know what he did in Chile. Okay. Now, here's a photo of the, I would say, fascist forces of Augusto Pinochet during the coup when Pinochet took over. Now, Chile may not be the most crucial country in the world, but remember that this is the Western Hemisphere. All countries in the Western Hemisphere look at the United States as a country that has intervened, that has tried to dominate the hemisphere very successfully, and that has sacrificed morality to strategy or to realism in its own self-interest. This is nothing to be proud of. Americans generally are not proud of the many interventions, many in the 19th century and in the 20th century on the part of the United States in order to remove regimes that the United States did not like. Now, what did Nixon's trip to China have to do with all of this? Nixon is here with his very good friend, Yahya Khan, the military dictator of West Pakistan, at a time when there were two Pakistans, West and East. East became Bangladesh. Nixon was obsessed as we all know, with China. I think as a realist, I don't think he cared about China. What he understood was there were some tensions between the Soviet Union and China in the 70s. And his wish was to get China to drive a wedge between the friendship between the Soviet Union and China. He saw that there were border conflicts and there were different approaches to things, and he wanted to exacerbate those differences. He did this with the help of Henry Kissinger, who went to Islamabad at this time in the early 70s, and in talking with Yahya Khan, was able to arrange. Yahya Khan was friendly with the regime in Beijing. He was the only friend of America who was also friends with China. Nixon understood, this is my opportunity. It was Kissinger who arranged the meeting for Nixon in Beijing. Now, at what cost? At what cost? This book, a very, very disturbing book, The Blood Telegram, named after Archer Blood, the American consul in Dhaka, in the country that later became Bangladesh. Gary Bass, the historian who brought out this history, Khan said, I will help you get to China. Here's what I want in return. I want weapons to kill people in East Pakistan who are rebelling against my country. This became a major genocide, which was made possible only with the help of Kissinger and Nixon, who defied an actual law, an actual statute. The Congress had said no weapons for dictatorships, and in particular, no weapons for Yahya Khan. They circumvented the law, Nixon and Kissinger. They found a way of getting weapons to West Pakistan with which a major genocide was conducted in East Pakistan. One of the, we know that, we don't know the numbers, but at least 200,000 dead, maybe as many as 3 million. That's Henry Kissinger. And, you know, I maybe I'm a bit obsessed here with Kissinger's terrible things that he did. Now, this reminds us, we're getting to the end here. This reminds us of the Armenian genocide in 1916, 1917. Here we have Archer Blood, who was writing telegrams from Dhaka to Washington saying, this must stop. There's a genocide going on. Washington ignored him. This reminds us of Henry Morgenthau, who was the American ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, who was well aware of the Armenian genocide, who resigned because of this, because he did everything he could to get the attention of the White House, and he failed. Result, Armenian genocide. I think Archer Blood and Henry Morgenthau, we must remember there are some individuals in the diplomatic service who are well aware of the consequences of pure realism, the suffering that it causes. And we must honor these people, in my opinion, who have done everything they could to oppose a policy which was permitting genocide. And this is just FYI, Henry Morgenthau was the father of Henry Morgenthau Jr., who was Secretary of the Treasury under FDR and who created Lend-Lease and formulated the Morgenthau Plan to deindustrialize Germany. I think he was directly involved in the Marshall Plan. That was the son of Henry Morgenthau. And Henry Morgenthau Jr., his son, was Robert Morgenthau, who was the district attorney in the city of New York, for a long time, almost 30 years. So, you know, when you hear Morgenthau, there's Hans Morgenthau, the realist, then there's Henry Morgenthau Jr., Robert Morgenthau. It's just a matter of keeping straight who were these Morgenthaus. The one we're concentrating here is the first one, Hans Morgenthau, the realist. now we get to the end of this, Robert Gates. I'm going to shorten this. I think we've gone on long enough. I can take this up at a future time, but we spoke with Robert Gates, the only surviving individual from all of these examples. His book on duty, it's amusing, it's instructive. He's a brilliant strategist. He's purely military. He was CIA, and he was the defense secretary under Bush 43 and also under Obama. 4 years, 2 years with a Republican, 2 years with a Democrat. We've met him. We've heard him speak to our group. He's good-natured, and he too says, don't try to do too much overextension. I think that's the theme of this discussion. Overextension will lead to failure. We can look at some of this in the future, but I will end with this. He just published this just 3 months ago, The Dysfunctional Superpower, a very dark view of the ability of the United States to even have a foreign policy when its legislature is so dysfunctional. And of course, he's absolutely right. At the time of greatest need in Ukraine, the Congress, the Speaker of the House, knowing that the votes would go in favor of support for Ukraine, sent everybody on vacation. At the earliest this could be considered would be February 28th. Terrible, terrible thing. So what have we been talking about? Grand strategy. And where do we arrive? Chekhov's garden. This is my little personal touch. I believe that in all this complicated world of reality, realism and idealism and interventionism, and I go back to the idea from George Kennan that the garden is the proper way of thinking of human relationships. Plant the seeds, have the patience to see what will happen. If you plant the seeds correctly, there could be a good outcome. And that's, again, I can go at much greater length with these, but it's now, I've gone for 90 minutes. I see a hand up. It's not mine. Let's see. I see my own hand up. That I didn't raise a hand. I don't know. Lisa is on the screen. Do you have thoughts, Lisa, about any of this?
Yeah, I just thought that at the end, in any crisis or in anything that needs our resolution, we just need a garden. I mean, I keep saying that till from the early days of the Russia's full-scale invasion, the only thing Russians can't take personally from me and from the Ukrainians is a hope. And in this regard, hope, my synonym to hope is a garden. So, and also it's also interesting, like after this 90-minute session, it's also interesting to see how this, like your reflections, put some people into one real. Probably it's hard to find other topics where you can put all of those people mentioned above today into like the one realm, into one discussion. And somehow you managed. And this is something I liked very much. And also I thought about like some, probably those materials exist, like can realists be bad, or can actually even people who are very and sometimes how being ideologists can also lead to some very bad things for humanity.
Absolutely.
Because you just think that, well, that's good. And also another thing I had at some point while you talked today, thinking about modern day authoritarians or dictators, what we see as bad, they see as good.
Yep.
And that's why we can, like, from their standpoint, they may assess themselves as very bright-minded optimists.
Indeed.
Just because they think what they do and their actions are good, they think that they're liberating people in Ukraine.
This is a great,
just because they made themselves believe in this.
Yeah, this is a great comment, Lisa, and reminds us that point of view is everything. And if you happen to be here, you think, my only response, and this is very academic and very abstract, if we can at least understand, well, we must, of course, understand why is Putin doing this shit? Does he really believe the phony history that he's articulated so many times? I think the way that we can become useful is to at least understand what is realism, what is idealism, knowing that both of them can be wrong. If George W. Bush was a realist and on that basis invaded Iraq, well then, I mean, rather, if he was an idealist, well then idealism, we must not do that. It's mistaken. These are, when we're not in a actual shooting battle, we must take the time we have to see some way of conceptualizing all of this. Realism is not good or bad. It's one way of reacting to challenges. Likewise, idealism. Both can make terrible mistakes and can cause enormous suffering. But at least we can understand what's behind it. Dimitro, what is your thinking?
What about my point of view that you said about dignity and moral? I think that is the best thing that people can have, and we must save these things in us.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And, Skokov and Brzezinski are in perfect agreement on that. It doesn't sound like strategy, does it? But just recognizing that human beings need that and require it and demand it. We need to know that if we're going to create policies that might succeed. Maybe with apologies, maybe not. We've talked in a very abstract way today, and we've talked about some historic figures, and they're all American, by the way. I can't speak for Macron or Brexit. I mean, that's just too much for me to cover. I'm only able to give some perspective on prominent Americans of the last century who have made policy and who have been who understood long strategy. They did some things right, they did some things wrong. In my opinion, everything Kissinger did was immoral and was a failure and led to millions of deaths. I think there's a real example, not abstract, but was he a realist? I don't know. They say he was, but any point of view can be destructive when it's used stupidly. And what we're doing here is to try to develop our own skills so that you on the call, when you are running foreign policy, and I think you will, to have a basis when you're in the middle of a crisis, you don't have time to look up Hans Morgenthau. Best to have internalized it earlier and to know how to draw on it when you're in the middle of a crisis. So thank you, everybody. This has been, I've gone on way too long, and it could have been twice the length. But next week, by the way, thank you, Lisa. Same to you. Luke Coffey is a Russian-Ukrainian specialist at the Hudson Institute. He's been very outspoken in favor of increased aid for Ukraine. Hudson is a rather conservative think tank. In this matter, I don't see much difference between conservatives and progressives. All people who are thinking about this challenge are all in favor of giving maximum help to Ukraine at this time. Luke Coffey is certainly of that camp. Again, you can say conservative, progressive, liberal. Sometimes these terms don't have great meaning. I just find it enriching to listen to everybody. And then following that, the following week, I believe we have Tibor Nagy, who was an American born in Hungary. came to America as a 9-year-old child, as a refugee, came as a refugee, became a U.S. Foreign Service officer, a diplomat, and was the Assistant Secretary for Africa during the Trump administration. I call him the accidental appointment because he did his own thing. He did not really pay much attention to what was happening in the White House at that time. He was very much respected and loved by American diplomats working in Africa, and he has an enormous hatred for the Russian Federation because he came as a refugee after the uprising in Budapest in 1956. So he is very outspoken, and those are the two things coming up. I'll put this on Google Classroom. Apologies for such length today and such abstraction, but when else can we talk about abstractions other than Monday mornings here and Monday afternoons over there? So see you next week with Luke Coffey. He's a great guy. Thank you, everybody. Thank you,
Bye.
Lisa and Dimitro. Thank you.